The knife trembled in my hands as I stood over James's sleeping form, watching the rise and fall of his chest in the moonlight streaming through our Oakland bedroom window. One swift motion, I thought just 137 years of hell would end forever. The metallic blade caught the silver light, and for a terrifying moment, I could see myself doing it, could feel the satisfying resistance as steel met flesh, could imagine the look of surprise in those cold green eyes that had terrorized me for so long. But then I heard the soft whimper from Marina's room next door. My 11-year-old daughter crying in her sleep again, probably dreaming of the scene that had unfolded just hours before. The scene where her father had raised his fist to strike her, and I had finally found the courage to say the words that would change everything. Not her, James. Never her. I lowered the knife, my hands shaking so violently I nearly dropped it. This wasn't how my story would end. Not with blood on my hands and my daughter witnessing her mother become the very monster she was trying to escape. Good morning, my dears. This is Grandma Janet, 68 years young, speaking to you from my sun-drenched porch in Monterey, California, where the Pacific Ocean stretches endlessly before me, as free and boundless as I never dreamed I could be. Looking at me now with my morning coffee, my flowering garden, and the gentle smile that finally reaches my eyes, you would never imagine the woman I once was. The woman who stood in that darkened bedroom in 1987, a kitchen knife in her trembling hands, contemplating murder as her only path to freedom. If this story touches your heart, please know that each person listening gives me strength to continue sharing what I've never told anyone, not completely, not the whole truth. Because the whole truth is messier than what makes it into the newspapers or police reports. It's about the moments that don't fit neatly into victim and survivor categories, the choices that haunt you even when they save you, and the unexpected heroes who appear when darkness seems absolute. I want to thank you for giving me your time, and I'd love to know where you're listening from. Each comment, each message reminds me that I'm no longer alone in the world, no longer that frightened woman whose voice was stolen by fear. I was born in 1957 in East Oakland, California, during an era when a woman's worth was measured by her ability to keep quiet, keep house, and keep her husband happy. My childhood home was a small wooden structure that seemed to sag under the weight of financial struggles and unfulfilled dreams. The floorboards creaked warnings under every footstep, and the walls were thin enough that we learned early to speak in whispers, good practice, as it turned out for the life that awaited me. My father, Thomas, worked the early shift at the Ford plant, leaving before dawn, with calloused hands and returning with whatever wages survived the foreman's mood and the day's mechanical failures. I remember the sound of his work boots on our front porch, the way they grew heavier with each passing year, as his back bent under the weight of providing for a family on a factory worker's salary. My mother, Grace, cleaned houses for the wealthy families in the Oakland Hills, her own hands permanently wrinkled from constant immersion in cleaning solutions and wash water. She would return each evening with her fingernails scraped clean and her knees aching from scrubbing floors that gleamed brighter than anything in our own home. Despite her exhaustion, she would sit with me after dinner, teaching me to read from the Bible and from the romance novels she secretly borrowed from her employer's libraries. "Education is important, Janet," she would whisper, glancing toward the living room where my father sat with his evening beer. "But don't let anyone know how smart you are. Men don't like women who think they know better." I attended school through 4th grade before my father decided I'd learned enough. "Girls don't need more schooling than that," he declared one morning over breakfast, his tone suggesting the matter was settled. "Just enough to read prices at the store and keep house accounts. Too much learning makes women dissatisfied with their lot in life." I wanted to argue God how I wanted to argue. I loved the feel of books in my hands, the way words could transport me beyond the walls of our cramped house to places where women wore fine dresses and made their own choices. But arguing with my father was like arguing with a brick wall, pointless and likely to leave you bruised. So I stopped attending school and began helping my mother with her house cleaning jobs, learning to make myself invisible in the presence of people who had everything I'd never dreamed of having. I learned to dust around their family photographs, images of mothers and daughters smiling together at graduation ceremonies, of families vacationing in places I couldn't pronounce. I learned that there were different ways of living in the world and that some people were simply born into the ones that mattered. I met James Sullivan on July 4, 1974, during Oakland's Independence Day celebration at Lake Merritt. I was 17, wearing a yellow sundress my mother had sewn from fabric remnants, and I felt almost pretty in the golden California sunshine. The festival buzzed with families spreading picnic blankets, children chasing each other around the lake's perimeter, and teenagers trying to look older than they were. James was 28 tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a crisp white shirt that somehow stayed unwrinkled despite the heat. Those green eyes, rare and striking in our predominantly brown-eyed neighborhood, seemed to see right through to something inside me that even I didn't know existed. When he approached me at the lemonade stand, his smile was confident in a way that made my stomach flutter, with something I mistook for love, but now recognize as the first whisper of fear. "You're too pretty to be standing here alone," he said, his voice carrying just a hint of an East Coast accent that made him seem worldly and sophisticated. "James Sullivan. I work security at First National Bank downtown." A bank security guard seemed impossibly important to a girl who'd never been inside a bank, whose family kept their meager savings in a coffee can hidden behind the flour canister. When James asked to walk me around the lake, I felt like Cinderella being noticed by the prince. Our courtship lasted 6 months, during which James transformed himself into everything I thought I wanted in a man. He brought me flowers, real roses from the florist, not wildflowers picked from someone's yard. He took me to restaurants where the waiters brought water without being asked, and where the food came on plates instead of paper. He bought me small gifts, a delicate silver bracelet, a bottle of perfume that made me feel sophisticated, a book of poetry that he said reminded him of my beautiful soul. My parents were enchanted. Here was a mature, employed, church-going man who treated their daughter with apparent respect and promised to provide for her better than they ever could. My father, in particular, seemed relieved that I would become someone else's responsibility. "James is a good man," he would say, nodding approvingly whenever James picked me up for our dates. "Steady job, knows the value of $1, goes to church every Sunday. He'll take care of you proper." What none of us recognized were the subtle signs that would later become glaring red flags. The way James always decided where we would go and what we would do. The questions that seemed caring, but were really interrogations. "Who did you talk to today? What did you discuss? Why did it take you so long to get ready?" The compliments that came with conditions. "You look beautiful tonight, much better than when you wear your hair that other way." The possessiveness that felt romantic at 17. "I don't like other men looking at you. You're mine now." The gifts that came with unspoken obligations, creating a debt I wouldn't fully understand until it was too late to repay. Our wedding took place on February 14th, 1975, Valentine's Day, which James insisted was perfect for a perfect love. The ceremony was held at St. Augustine's Catholic Church, the same church where my parents had married 23 years earlier. I walked down the aisle in a dress my mother had spent 3 months sewing the white satin, reflecting the colored light streaming through the stained glass windows. I remember my father's proud smile as he placed my hand in James's, officially transferring ownership of his daughter to her new master. I remember the way James's fingers closed around mine, not gently, but firmly, like a lock clicking into place. And I remember the words he whispered in my ear during our first dance at the reception. "Now you're mine forever, Janet. No one else will ever have you." At the time, those words sent shivers of what I thought was romantic excitement down my spine. I didn't hear the promise of imprisonment hidden within what sounded like a declaration of eternal love. Our first home was a small 2-story house on 73rd Avenue in East Oakland, with pale yellow siding and a front porch that faced west toward the bay. It had 2 bedrooms, a kitchen with appliances that actually worked, and a small backyard where I imagined growing vegetables and maybe keeping chickens. By the standards of my childhood, it was a mansion. James had saved for 3 years to make the down payment, a fact he mentioned regularly. "Not every man your age would have a house this nice," he would say usually when I expressed any small dissatisfaction with my new life. "Your father never owned property. Hell, your family never owned anything worth owning. You should be grateful." Gratitude became the currency with which I was expected to pay for shelter, food, and the privilege of being Mrs. James Sullivan. Grateful for the roof over my head. Grateful for the food on my table. Grateful for a husband who worked hard to provide for his family. Grateful, always grateful, never questioning whether gratitude should require the surrender of every other feeling. The changes came gradually, so subtly that I didn't recognize them as changes at all. James began checking the odometer on the car after I ran errands, timing my trips to the grocery store, counting the change to ensure I hadn't made any unauthorized purchases. When I mentioned this to my mother during one of her increasingly rare visits, she dismissed my concerns with a wave of her hand. "All men are protective of their money, dear. It's not personal. James just wants to make sure you're being responsible." Responsible. The word followed me everywhere, a constant reminder that my judgment couldn't be trusted, that my desires were probably frivolous, that my thoughts were likely wrong. When I wanted to visit my childhood friend Susan, who lived 3 blocks away, James would suggest that Susan was the kind of woman who fills wives' heads with foolish ideas. When I expressed interest in taking a cooking class at the community center, he wondered aloud why I would want to learn from strangers when I had a perfectly good kitchen and cookbooks right here at home. One by one, my connections to the outside world were severed, always for my own good. Always for the good of our marriage, always presented as loving protection rather than systematic isolation. When I became pregnant with Marina in late 1975, James's reaction was complex pride, mixed with an intensified need to control not just me, but the life growing inside me. "You're carrying my child now," he would say, his hand resting possessively on my expanding belly. "That makes you more precious than ever. I have to protect both of you." Protection, I learned, looked remarkably like imprisonment. My pregnancy was difficult from the beginning. Severe morning sickness kept me bedridden for the first 4 months, and high blood pressure in the later months made the doctor recommend complete rest. James seized upon this medical advice as justification for his increasing restrictions. "Doctor's orders," he would say each morning before leaving for work. "You don't leave this house, you don't answer the door unless you know who it is, and you don't do anything that might upset the baby. I'll have my mother check on you." Mrs. Eleanor Sullivan was a thin, sharp-faced woman with disapproving eyes and the demeanor of someone who had never been wrong about anything in her 72 years of life. She arrived each morning at precisely 9 a.m., letting herself in with the key James had given her, and positioned herself like a guard in our living room. "James worries about you," she would say in her reedy voice, settling into the armchair with her knitting and her watchful gaze. Young women today don't understand how delicate pregnancy can be. In my day, we knew better than to take chances. Mrs. Eleanor reported everything: how long I spent in the bathroom, what I ate for lunch, whether I seemed restless or content, any visitors who came to the door. When my mother stopped by one afternoon with a pot of homemade soup, Mrs. Eleanor noted the time she arrived, the duration of her visit, and the topics of our conversation. "Your mother seems to think you need more social stimulation," she informed James that evening. I told her that pregnancy requires peace and quiet, not constant chatter and excitement. After that, my mother's visits became less frequent, then stopped altogether. Years later, I learned that James had called her privately, explaining that her visits agitated me and might harm the baby. My mother, terrified of being responsible for her grandchild's health, reluctantly agreed to stay away until after the birth. Marina Rose Sullivan was born on December 15, 1976, after 14 hours of labor that James spent in the hospital's waiting room bar. A man's place isn't in the delivery room, he had declared when I begged him to stay with me. That's women's business. I'll wait until it's over. When I finally held my daughter in my arms, something fundamental shifted inside me. This tiny, perfect creature with her father's green eyes and my stubborn chin was mine in a way that nothing else had ever been. She was part of me, but she was also completely herself, a separate soul that I was responsible for protecting and nurturing and setting free to become whoever she was meant to be. Looking into Marina's eyes, I made a silent promise that would sustain me through the next 11 years. I will give you a different life. You will have choices. You will be free. But how do you give freedom to someone when you don't have it yourself? How do you model independence when your every movement is monitored, your every decision questioned, your every desire filtered through someone else's approval? The years that followed Marina's birth were marked by an escalating pattern of control that I now recognize as textbook emotional and psychological abuse, though those terms weren't part of my vocabulary then. I knew only that I felt constantly watched, constantly judged, constantly found wanting. James's jealousy became a living thing that fed on the smallest interactions. If the mailman smiled at me, it was because I had encouraged him. If a neighbor asked how I was doing, it was because I had given him ideas. If I took more than 30 minutes at the grocery store, it was because I had been meeting someone. You think I don't see what you're doing? He would hiss his face inches from mine, his breath hot with anger, and the beer he'd started drinking more frequently. You think I don't notice how you swing your hips when you walk, how you smile at other men, how you dress to get attention? I began walking with my eyes down, wearing loose, shapeless clothing, even in the sweltering Oakland summers, speaking only when spoken to during our rare public outings. It was safer that way. When James's jealousy exploded into rage, the pattern was always the same. First the accusations, then the shouting, then the pushing, then the hitting, then the tearful apologies and promises that it would never happen again. Marina grew up watching this cycle, learning that love looked like fear, that marriage meant walking on eggshells, that a woman's role was to absorb a man's anger and somehow transform it into peace. She became a quiet, observant child who seemed older than her years, who knew to disappear into her room when she heard her father's key in the lock, who learned to read his moods like a survival guide. Sometimes when James was at work, Marina and I allowed ourselves small rebellions. We would dance to the radio while doing housework, make up silly songs about our cat, or spread all the couch cushions on the floor and pretend we were camping in exotic locations. But these moments of joy were always shadowed by the knowledge that they had to end. When we heard the gate creak, when we saw James's car pull into the driveway, when it was time to return to our roles as the quiet, grateful wife and the well-behaved daughter. Why is Daddy always angry? Marina asked me one evening when she was 8, after James had swept all the dishes off the kitchen table because dinner was 5 minutes late. Doesn't he love us? How do you explain to a child that love can be twisted into something unrecognizable, that it can become possessive and controlling and destructive? How do you tell your daughter that her father does love us, but in a way that hurts, in a way that suffocates, in a way that slowly kills the very thing it claims to cherish? Daddy has problems, sweetheart, I whispered, holding her close while we swept up the broken dishes. But those problems are not your fault. They're not my fault either. Sometimes adults have feelings they don't know how to handle properly. But privately, I believed it was my fault. I wasn't pretty enough, wasn't grateful enough, wasn't good enough at managing his moods or anticipating his needs. If I could just be better, more patient, more understanding, more perfect, maybe the violence would stop. Maybe I could love him into becoming the man he'd seemed to be during our courtship. The 1980s arrived with promises of change that filtered into our lives through the television screen James allowed because he enjoyed watching football and the evening news. I caught glimpses of a changing world, women entering previously male-dominated professions, speaking confidently about their rights and choices, demanding equality in ways that seemed both inspiring and terrifying. One evening in 1983, I watched a news segment about a women's shelter that had opened in downtown Oakland. The reporter interviewed women who had left abusive relationships, who spoke about finding the courage to choose their own lives, who talked about resources and support and the possibility of starting over. "Turn that off," James ordered from his chair, his voice sharp with disgust. "Bunch of whores and troublemakers trying to destroy families. A real woman stands by her husband no matter what." But I had seen something in those women's faces, a spark of life that I recognized because I remembered having it once long ago, before it had been systematically extinguished. That night, after James fell asleep, I lay awake thinking about what it would feel like to make decisions without asking permission to speak, without measuring every word to exist, without constantly apologizing for taking up space in the world. I began my rebellion in the smallest possible way by saving coins. Quarters from the grocery money that James counted but didn't scrutinize to the penny. Dimes found in his pockets when I did the laundry. Nickels discovered in the couch cushions. I hid them in a small hole I dug beneath the loose floorboard under the kitchen cabinet, covering my treasure with a piece of cardboard and then replacing the board carefully. It wasn't much, maybe $3 or $4 a month, but it was mine. My secret, my possibility, my tiny act of defiance against a life that felt increasingly like a prison sentence. I also began doing laundry for Mrs. Chen, who owned the corner market where I shopped for groceries. She paid me with food that I told James I had purchased with the grocery money, claiming I'd found special sales that allowed us to eat better for the same cost. The work itself was nothing, washing and ironing shirts for her husband and teenage sons, but the fact that I was earning money, however small, felt revolutionary. Marina became my silent accomplice in these small deceptions. At 10 years old, she helped me invent explanations for the extra food, reminded me to hide the coins when she heard her father's car approaching, and never asked questions about the careful balance we maintained between truth and survival. "Someday, we'll have enough money to go somewhere," she whispered to me one afternoon as we folded Mrs. Chen's laundry together. "Somewhere Daddy can't find us. Somewhere we can be happy all the time instead of just when he's not home." I smiled and stroked her hair, but privately, I wondered if either of us would have the courage to actually leave. The world outside our house had become so foreign to me that I wasn't sure I remembered how to navigate it. What would we do for money? Where would we live? How would I protect Marina if we were homeless, if we were truly alone? The morning of April 26, 1987, dawned crisp and clear with the kind of California sunshine that makes everything seem possible. I woke before James and Marina, luxuriating in the rare quiet of the house, watching dust motes dance in the golden light that streamed through our bedroom window. Something felt different that morning, though I couldn't identify what it was. An electricity in the air, a sense of impending change that made my skin prickle with anticipation and anxiety. I made coffee, slowly savoring the ritual and the solitude, listening to the sounds of the neighborhood waking up around us. That's when I heard the soft knock at our back door. My heart immediately began racing. Unexpected visitors were always dangerous in James's world, always requiring explanations that I could never give to his satisfaction. I opened the door, just a crack, ready to quickly dismiss whoever was there. It was Zoe Martinez, our neighbor from 2 houses down. I knew her only in passing hurried greetings at the mailbox, polite nods across the street, the kind of careful distance I maintained with everyone outside our household. She was a robust woman, in her 40s, with graying hair and kind eyes that seemed to see more than most people's. "Mrs. Sullivan?" she said quietly, obviously aware that it was early and that my husband might still be sleeping. "I hope you don't mind me stopping by. I wanted to invite you to have tea with some of the ladies from the neighborhood this afternoon. Nothing formal, just a chance to chat and get to know each other better." The automatic refusal was already forming on my lips, the practiced response I'd given to every social invitation for the past 12 years. I can't, my husband doesn't. But Zoe held up a gentle hand. He goes out Sunday afternoons to play poker at Murphy's Tavern, doesn't he? You could just come for an hour or two. When's the last time you had a conversation with other women, Janet? When's the last time you laughed about something silly or shared a recipe or just sat in the sunshine with friends? The question hit me like a physical blow. I couldn't remember. The isolation had been so gradual, so completely justified as being for my own good and for the good of our marriage, that I'd forgotten what normal social interaction felt like. I'll think about it, I heard myself saying, even as my mind raced with all the reasons why it was impossible, dangerous, not worth the risk. Please do, Zoe said with a smile that seemed to light up her entire face. We meet at my house around 2 o'clock. Nothing fancy, just tea and cookies and women talking. You'd be very welcome. After she left, I spent the morning in a state of internal debate that felt almost violent in its intensity. Part of me desperately wanted to go, craved human connection and conversation, and the simple pleasure of being around other women. But another part of me, the part that had learned to survive by avoiding anything that might trigger James's rage, whispered warnings about all the ways this could go wrong. What if someone saw me going to Zoe's house? What if James came home early? What if the other women asked questions I couldn't answer? Noticed bruises I couldn't explain? Saw through the facade I'd worked so hard to maintain? James left for his poker game at 1:30 as he did every Sunday, but not before delivering his usual warnings. Don't leave the house. Don't answer the door unless you know who it is. And have dinner ready when I get back. I'm not coming home to an empty table because you've been lazy all afternoon. After his car disappeared around the corner, I stood in the living room for 10 minutes, staring at the wall, my heart pounding as if I'd just run a marathon. Marina watched me from the couch, where she was reading her green eyes, alert and questioning. "Mama," she said finally, "are you okay?" I looked at my 11-year-old daughter, so wise, so careful, so accustomed to reading the emotional weather of our household and adjusting her behavior accordingly. What was I teaching her about being a woman in the world? What lessons was she learning about her own worth, her own rights, her own possibilities? "Marina," I said, surprised by the steadiness in my own voice. "We're going next door to visit Mrs. Martinez for a little while." Her eyes widened. "But Daddy said—" "I know what Daddy said. But sometimes we have to make our own decisions about what's right for us. And right now, I think it's right for us to go visit our neighbors." I changed into a dress I hadn't worn in over a year, a simple blue cotton sundress that James had criticized as too bright and attention-seeking. I brushed my hair until it shone and even applied a light touch of lipstick that I'd hidden in the back of my dresser drawer. Looking in the mirror, I saw a woman I barely recognized. Still young at 30, but with eyes that looked much older, with a face that had learned to expect disappointment, with shoulders that carried the weight of constant vigilance. But there was something else there too, a spark of defiance, a glimmer of the girl I'd once been, before I learned to make myself invisible. Zoe's living room was filled with women, 7 of them, ranging in age from their 20s to their 70s, all chatting and laughing in a way that sounded like music after years of careful, measured conversations. The room itself was warm and welcoming, with mismatched furniture and family photographs covering every surface, plants thriving in the sunny windows, and the comfortable clutter of a home where people actually lived instead of just existing. Ladies," Zoe announced as Marina and I hesitated in the doorway, "I'd like you to meet my neighbor Janet Sullivan and her daughter Marina. First time joining us." The women turned toward us with genuine smiles and warm greetings that made me realize how long it had been since anyone had seemed genuinely happy to see me. They made room on the couch, poured tea into mismatched cups, offered cookies from a plate that got passed around the circle, and resumed their conversation with an easy inclusiveness that felt revolutionary. They talked about their children's school activities, shared recipes and gardening tips, discussed books they'd read and movies they'd seen, gossiped gently about neighborhood happenings. It was the kind of ordinary conversation that I'd forgotten existed, talk that had no hidden meanings, no traps to navigate, no consequences to fear. I sat mostly in silence, overwhelmed by the simple pleasure of being around other women, of hearing their laughter, of feeling included in something that had nothing to do with managing a man's moods or walking on eggshells to avoid conflict. It was Susan Patterson, a white-haired woman in her 60s with intelligent eyes and work-worn hands, who finally addressed the elephant in the room. Janet, honey," she said gently. "I hope you don't mind me saying, but that's a nasty bruise on your wrist. Are you all right?" The room went quiet. Everyone knew, I realized, with a mixture of shame and relief. They had all seen the signs, heard the arguments through thin walls, noticed my isolation, and carefully composed excuses for not participating in neighborhood activities. But instead of judgment or pity in their faces, I saw understanding, compassion, and something that looked like solidarity. "I'm fine," I started to say automatically, the lie that had become as natural as breathing. But Susan shook her head. "No, honey, you're not fine. None of us would be fine living like that. The question is, what are you going to do about it?" The tears came without warning. Years of suppressed grief and fear and loneliness pouring out of me in great gasping sobs that shook my entire body. Marina moved closer on the couch, her small hand finding mine, and I felt the warmth of women surrounding me, offering comfort without conditions, understanding without judgment. "I don't know how," I whispered when I could finally speak. "I don't know how to leave. I don't have money. I don't have anywhere to go. I don't know how to take care of myself and Marina. He's made sure of that." "Of course he has," said Maria Santos, a younger woman with kind eyes and calloused hands that spoke of hard work. "That's what they do, make you believe you can't survive without them. But you can, Janet. Women have been doing it for centuries, and you can too." The stories came then shared around the circle like sacred texts. Susan, who had left her abusive husband 20 years earlier, with 3 small children and $50, and who now owned a small restaurant downtown. Maria, who had escaped an abusive boyfriend by hiding in her sister's attic for 3 months, and who was now studying to become a nurse. Eleanor Kim, whose husband had controlled every penny until she learned to forge his signature and opened her own bank account, eventually saving enough to buy her own house after he died. Stories of women who had found ways to survive, to escape, to build new lives from the ashes of the old ones. Not fairy tales with perfect endings, but real stories about real women who had looked at impossible situations and found ways to make them possible. "The first step," Susan said, "is believing you deserve better." Do you believe that, Janet? I looked around the circle at these women who had taken me in without question, who had shared their stories and their strength, who had seen my pain and offered hope instead of judgment. For the first time in over a decade, I felt like I was part of something larger than my own fear. "Yes," I said, and meant it. "I believe I deserve better. We both do." Time moved differently that afternoon, too fast and too slow simultaneously. I knew I needed to get home before James returned from his poker game. But I also knew that something fundamental had shifted inside me, something that couldn't be unchanged, no matter how carefully I tried to resume my old role. Zoe pressed a folded piece of paper into my palm as we prepared to leave. "My sister Dorothy lives in San Francisco," she whispered. "If you ever need help, if you ever decide to leave, call her. She's helped other women in your situation. She knows people, knows resources, knows how to disappear when you need to." I tucked the paper into my bra, the only place James never searched, and walked home with Marina, both of us quiet, but somehow different. The familiar streets looked the same, but I saw them through new eyes, not as boundaries of my prison, but as pathways that could lead somewhere else if I was brave enough to follow them. James returned home at 6:30, already irritated from losing money at cards and suspicious in the way that alcohol made him. He studied my face carefully as I served his dinner, looking for signs of disobedience, traces of rebellion, evidence that his wife had done something requiring punishment. "You look different," he said finally, his green eyes narrowing as they searched my face. "There's something different about you." My heart hammered against my ribs, but I kept my voice steady. "I don't know what you mean. Marina and I spent the afternoon reading. I made your favorite roast for dinner." He continued staring at me throughout the meal, and I could feel his suspicion like a physical weight pressing down on me. When he reached across the table and grabbed my wrist, the same one Susan had noticed was bruised, I forced myself not to flinch. "If I find out you've been lying to me, Janet, if I discover you've been doing things behind my back?" He didn't finish the threat. He didn't need to. We both knew what would happen. That night, after James fell asleep, I lay awake making plans that seemed simultaneously impossible and inevitable. The money I'd saved over the years, was it enough for bus tickets to San Francisco? Would Dorothy really help us, or was Zoe's offer just polite words without substance? How long would it take James to track us down? What would he do when he found us? But underneath the practical concerns was something new, a determination that felt like steel in my spine, like fire in my belly, like the stubborn seed of hope that somehow survives even when everything around it dies. 3 days later, on Wednesday morning, my carefully constructed plans crumbled with the discovery that the universe has a cruel sense of timing. James left for work as usual, kissing my cheek with lips that felt cold despite the warmth of the morning. As soon as his car disappeared around the corner, I hurried to the kitchen and pried up the loose floorboard where I'd hidden my secret savings. The space was empty. In place of the coins and bills I'd carefully accumulated over 4 years, was a crumpled note in James's familiar handwriting. "Did you really think I didn't know about your little nest egg? My wife doesn't keep secrets from me, especially not money secrets." I sank to my knees on the kitchen floor, the note trembling in my hands, my carefully controlled composure finally shattering completely. He'd known. Perhaps he'd always known. He'd let me believe I had this small measure of independence, this tiny rebellion, only to reveal at the moment I needed it most that even this had been an illusion. Marina found me there, crumpled on the linoleum, silent tears streaming down my face. "Mama, what's wrong?" She dropped her school bag and knelt beside me, her young face creased with concern that no 11-year-old should have to carry. I showed her the note, unable to find words to explain that our escape plan, our hope for a different life, had just evaporated like morning mist. She read it quickly, her eyes widening with understanding, and something that looked remarkably like anger. "We can't stay here anymore, Mama," she said with a firmness that surprised me. "Last night I heard him talking on the phone to someone about teaching you a lesson about keeping secrets. We have to leave today, right now, before he comes home." Her words sent ice through my veins. James had been making phone calls about me. To whom? What kind of lesson was he planning? I thought of Zoe's sister's phone number still hidden in my bra. Without the money I'd saved, I had no way to pay for bus tickets to San Francisco. No way to survive once we got there. No way to support us while we figured out what came next. But staying was no longer an option. I could feel that in my bones, in the way the morning light seemed different, in the way the walls of our house suddenly felt like they were closing in. "Mama," Marina's voice was small, scared but determined. "I have some money." She ran to her room and returned with a small cloth bag that she'd hidden behind her dresser. Inside were quarters, dollar bills, and even a few fives money she'd saved from birthday gifts, from small chores she'd done for neighbors, from the occasional tooth that still merited a visit from the tooth fairy. "It's not much," she said, "but maybe it's enough for bus tickets." Looking at my daughter's savings, her own small rebellion, her own hope for the future, I felt something shift inside me. This wasn't just about my freedom anymore. This was about breaking a cycle that would otherwise continue, about making sure Marina learned that women have choices, that they don't have to accept lives that diminish them, that sometimes the scariest thing you can do is also the right thing. The walk to the payphone felt like a journey across enemy territory. Every car that passed might contain James coming home unexpectedly from work. Every neighbor who saw us might report our movements. Every step took us further from the familiar safety of our prison and closer to an uncertain future. Marina held my hand tightly as I dialed the number Zoe had given me, both of us holding our breath as the phone rang once, twice, 3 times. "Hello." The voice was female, middle-aged, cautious. "Is this Dorothy, Zoe Martinez's sister?" My voice came out as barely a whisper. "Yes, who's calling?" "My name is Janet Sullivan. I'm Zoe's neighbor. She said you might be able to help women who need to get away from—" "I understand." Dorothy's voice immediately became warmer, more reassuring. "Are you in immediate danger?" "I think so. My husband found money I'd been hiding. He's planning something. My daughter and I need to leave today, but we don't have enough money for—" "Stop," Dorothy interrupted gently. "Don't say any more over the phone. Do you know where the Greyhound station is downtown?" I did. James had pointed it out once, making some disparaging comment about the kinds of people who traveled by bus. "Go there now," Dorothy continued. "Take nothing but what you absolutely need: identification. Any money, you have a change of clothes for you and your daughter. When you get to the station, call me again from the payphone there. I'll arrange for tickets and someone to meet you in San Francisco. Can you do that?" "Yes," I said, surprised by my own certainty. "Yes, we can do that." "Janet." Dorothy's voice was gentle but firm. "Once you walk out that door, don't look back. Don't change your mind. Don't let fear convince you to return to what's familiar. The only direction is forward. Do you understand?" "I understand." We had 20 minutes to pack our lives into 2 small bags before James's lunch break, when he sometimes came home unexpectedly. I moved through our house like a sleepwalker, selecting items based on necessity rather than sentiment. Identification documents from the fireproof box in our bedroom closet. 1 change of clothes each. Marina's favorite stuffed animal, a ratty elephant named Mr. Peanuts that she'd had since she was 3. My mother's small silver cross, the only thing of value I owned that was truly mine. Everything else, the wedding photos, the few pieces of jewelry James had given me, the books I'd treasured, the small mementos of Marina's childhood, had to be left behind. They belonged to our old life, and we were walking into a new one where the weight of the past might be too heavy to carry. Marina packed with the efficiency of someone much older, including practical items I hadn't thought of: soap, toothbrushes, a small first aid kit she'd assembled for a Girl Scout badge. She moved through the house saying silent goodbyes to rooms and objects, but her face was set with determination. At the front door, we paused for just a moment. This house had been my prison, but it had also been the only home Marina had ever known. It was where she'd taken her first steps, lost her first tooth, learned to read. It was where I'd dreamed of the family we might become before those dreams curdled into nightmares. Ready, Mama?" Marina asked, her small hand finding mine. I took one last look at the yellow walls, the familiar furniture, the carefully maintained facade of a normal family home. Then I opened the door and stepped into the California sunshine, into uncertainty, into possibility. "Ready," I said. The bus ride downtown passed in a blur of terror and adrenaline. Every red light felt like an eternity. Every delay made me certain that James would somehow appear, would drag us off the bus, would punish us for daring to imagine we could leave. But the city streets rolled past the window, carrying us away from East Oakland, away from the life that had nearly killed us both. The Greyhound station was exactly what I'd expected. Fluorescent lights, plastic chairs, the smell of industrial disinfectant mixed with exhaust fumes and human desperation. The kind of place where people came when they were running from something, or toward something, but rarely when they were content with where they were. I called Dorothy again from the payphone, my hands shaking as I fed quarters into the slot. "We're here," I said when she answered. "Good. Go to the ticket counter and ask for Mary Chen. Tell her Dorothy sent you. She'll have your tickets ready." Mary Chen was a small, efficient woman with kind eyes who asked no questions and required no explanations. She handed us 2 tickets to San Francisco departure in 45 minutes, and a small envelope containing enough cash for food during the journey. "Safe travels," she said simply, her smile conveying understanding and support that needed no words. The bus to San Francisco was half empty, filled mostly with people who looked like they were carrying their own secrets, their own reasons for traveling in the middle of a weekday afternoon. Marina and I found seats near the back, and I spent the first hour of the journey constantly looking over my shoulder, expecting to see James boarding at the next stop, having somehow tracked us down. But gradually, as the miles accumulated between us and Oakland, I began to relax in increments. The familiar landmarks disappeared, replaced by scenery I'd never seen before. The bus crossed the Bay Bridge, and I watched the San Francisco skyline grow larger through the window, a city that represented possibility rather than imprisonment. Marina fell asleep against my shoulder, exhausted by the emotional weight of the day. I watched her sleep and tried to imagine what our new life might look like. Would we live in an apartment? Would Marina have to change schools? Would I be able to find work that paid enough to support us? The practical questions seemed overwhelming, but underneath them was something I hadn't felt in over a decade: excitement about an unknown future. When the bus pulled into the San Francisco station, I woke Marina gently and gathered our small collection of belongings. Dorothy had said someone would meet us, but I wasn't sure how we'd recognize each other in the busy terminal. I needn't have worried. A woman about my age with warm brown eyes and graying hair was standing near the information booth holding a small sign with Janet S. written in neat handwriting. She looked like the kind of person you could trust with your secrets, with your fears, with your hope for something better. "Janet," she asked as we approached. "I'm Dorothy Martinez. Welcome to San Francisco." Dorothy's house was a small Victorian in the Mission District, painted cheerful yellow with white trim, and a garden full of flowers that bloomed in defiance of the urban environment. The neighborhood was alive with activity, children playing in the streets, neighbors chatting over fences, the sound of music and laughter drifting from open windows. "It's not much," Dorothy said as she led us up the front steps. "But it's safe, and sometimes safe is all we need to start rebuilding." The interior was comfortable and lived in, with mismatched furniture and family photographs covering every surface. A girl about Marina's age was doing homework at the kitchen table, and she looked up with curious but friendly eyes when we entered. "This is my daughter Carmen," Dorothy explained. "Carmen, this is Mrs. Janet and her daughter Marina. They're going to be staying with us for a while." Carmen smiled shyly at Marina. "Do you want to see my room? I have books and games and stuff." As the girls disappeared upstairs, chattering in the way children do when they're sizing each other up as potential friends, Dorothy and I sat in her small kitchen. She made coffee and set out a plate of cookies, creating an atmosphere of normalcy that felt almost surreal after the intensity of the day. "Tell me what you need," she said simply. The question was so direct, so without judgment or conditions, that it took me a moment to respond. What did I need? Safety, certainly. But beyond that, I need to disappear, I said finally. James will look for us. He won't accept that we've left. He'll find ways to make us come back, or he'll make sure we can't stay away. Dorothy nodded as if she'd heard this story many times before. How much time do we have before he realizes you're gone? He gets home from work at 6. When we're not there, when dinner isn't ready? I shuddered, imagining his rage. He'll start looking immediately. Then we need to get you both further away from here. I have connections in Southern California, women who run safe houses, who help with new identities, who know how to make people disappear when they need to. Are you willing to go that far? The idea of leaving California entirely, of putting hundreds of miles between us and everything familiar, was terrifying. But the alternative, being found by James, dragged back to that house, punished for daring to leave, was infinitely worse. Yes, I said, whatever it takes. What I discovered over the next few days was that there was an entire network of women who helped other women escape domestic violence. Not an official organization with offices and business cards, but an informal underground railroad that operated through word of mouth, through trust built slowly over shared experiences, through the understanding that sometimes the only thing standing between a woman and death was another woman willing to take risks. Dorothy made phone calls using coded language that I gradually learned to interpret. My friend needs a vacation meant someone required immediate relocation. She's looking for work opportunities meant financial assistance was needed. Her daughter needs a new school meant children were involved and extra care had to be taken. On our second night in San Francisco, Dorothy sat me down with a cup of tea and a stack of forms. "We're going to get you to San Diego," she explained. "I have a friend there who runs a boarding house for women in transition. It's not fancy, but it's safe and affordable. The police there are more progressive about domestic violence cases. They'll help you get restraining orders, legal protection, whatever you need." She spread out a map of California, tracing the route with her finger. "The problem is getting you there without leaving a trail. Bus stations keep records. Airline tickets require identification that can be traced. We need to be creative." The solution came from an unexpected source, Dorothy's neighbor, Tony Vasquez, who drove a delivery truck between San Francisco and Los Angeles, making regular stops in cities along the way, including San Diego. For a modest fee paid by Dorothy and her network of friends, he agreed to transport some packages that needed special handling. "It won't be comfortable," Dorothy warned. "You'll be hidden in the back with legitimate cargo. The trip takes 2 days with overnight stops. But Tony's been doing this for years. He knows which inspection stations to avoid, which routes are safest." The plan was risky, but it was better than any alternative I could imagine. The morning of our departure, Dorothy helped me write a letter to Zoe, thanking her for the tea invitation that had changed everything and asking her to let my neighbors know that Marina and I were safe. "Don't include any details about where you're going," Dorothy advised. "Just enough to prevent them from worrying, not enough to help anyone track you down." Tony's truck was old and reliable, with a cargo area that had been modified to include a small hidden compartment behind legitimate merchandise. The space was cramped, barely large enough for Marina and me to sit upright, but it was ventilated and equipped with water food and a chemical toilet that preserved our dignity during the long journey. "I pick up women like you maybe once a month," Tony explained as he helped us settle into our hiding place. "Never had any problems, never been searched, never had anyone get hurt. Just stay quiet during stops, don't make any noise when I'm talking to anyone official, and trust that I know what I'm doing." The journey south was an exercise in sensory deprivation. Wrapped in darkness with only thin slices of light filtering through gaps in the truck's construction, we could only guess at our location by the sounds that penetrated our mobile hiding place. The stop-and-go rhythm of city traffic giving way to the steady hum of highway travel. The echo of bridges overhead. The sound of Tony's voice during fuel stops, always cheerful and casual, never betraying the fact that he was transporting human cargo. Marina handled the confinement better than I did, perhaps because her world had already been so restricted that this felt more like an adventure than a punishment. She slept fitfully against my shoulder, whispering stories about what our new life might look like, about the ocean she'd never seen, about the possibility of making new friends who didn't know about her father's anger. On the second day, somewhere south of Los Angeles, we hit our first real crisis. The truck slowed, then stopped completely, and we could hear voices outside, official-sounding voices asking Tony questions about his cargo, his destination, his delivery schedule. Routine agricultural inspection. Tony's voice drifted back to us calm and unconcerned. "Just checking for any unauthorized plant materials. You know how it is." Marina gripped my hand so tightly, I thought she might break my fingers. We could hear footsteps circling the truck, the sound of cargo being shifted and examined. My heart pounded so loudly, I was certain the inspectors would hear it through the metal walls of our hiding place. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, the voices faded away. The truck's engine rumbled back to life, and we were moving again. Close one," Tony called back to us once we were safely down the highway. "They were looking for something specific, drugs probably. Had nothing to do with you ladies, but still got my blood pumping." San Diego at sunset was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. When Tony finally opened our hiding place and helped us emerge on legs that were stiff from confinement, the first thing that hit me was the smell of salt air, the sound of seagulls, the sight of palm trees silhouetted against a sky painted in shades of orange and pink. "Welcome to your new life," Tony said with a smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "Rachel's expecting you. Good luck, ladies." Rachel Morales was Dorothy's cousin, a woman in her 50s who managed a small boarding house near downtown San Diego. The building was old but well-maintained, with a dozen rooms that housed an eclectic mix of residents, elderly people on fixed incomes, young adults starting their careers, and women like me who were starting over. "Rule number 1, Rachel explained as she showed us to a small room on the second floor. "No one asks questions they don't need answers to. Everyone here has a story, and everyone deserves privacy until they're ready to share. Rule number 2, we look out for each other. This isn't just a place to sleep, it's a community." Our room was tiny, barely space for 2 single beds, a shared dresser, and a window that looked out over the alley behind the building. But it was ours, and for the first time in Marina's life, she had a door she could close, a space that belonged to her privacy that didn't depend on her father's mood. That first night in San Diego, as Marina slept soundly in her own bed for the first time ever, I sat by the window looking out at the city lights and tried to process what we'd accomplished. We had done it. We had actually escaped. We were hundreds of miles from Oakland, living under assumed names. Rachel had provided us with documentation that would pass casual inspection in a place James would never think to look for us. But beneath the relief and exhaustion was something else, the overwhelming realization that now we had to figure out how to actually live, how to support ourselves, how to blend into a new community, how to build a life from nothing. The first month in San Diego was the hardest of my life, which is saying something considering what I'd endured in Oakland. Everything was unfamiliar, the streets, the accents, the rhythms of daily life in a different city. I had to learn to navigate without constantly looking over my shoulder, to speak to strangers without calculating whether they might report back to James, to make decisions without seeking anyone's permission. Rachel helped me find work cleaning houses for wealthy families in La Jolla, the kind of work that paid cash and didn't require extensive background checks or references that might lead back to my previous life. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was doing the same work my mother had done, scrubbing other people's floors and toilets, making their lives comfortable while barely surviving myself. But there was dignity in this work that had been absent from my life in Oakland. I was earning money through my own labor, making my own decisions about how to spend it, contributing to my daughter's welfare through my own efforts rather than existing as a dependent. Marina enrolled in the local elementary school under the name Marina Martinez. Rachel's suggestion, common enough to blend in, but different enough from Sullivan to provide some protection. She was nervous about starting over, about making new friends, about explaining where she'd come from to curious classmates. "What do I tell them about Daddy?" she asked me one evening as we walked along the beach near our boarding house. It was a question I'd been dreading. How do you explain to an 11-year-old that she can never mention her father, never talk about her life before San Diego, never let slip details that might somehow make their way back to the man who was undoubtedly searching for them? "You tell them your daddy lives far away," I said finally. "That's not a lie, he does live far away now. If they ask more questions, you just say you don't like to talk about it, and most people will understand." She nodded solemnly, accepting another burden that no child should have to carry. But she adapted with the resilience that children possess, making friends with her classmates, excelling in her studies, gradually losing the hypervigilance that had marked her behavior in Oakland. 3 months into our new life, just as I was beginning to believe we might actually be safe, the phone call came that shattered my growing sense of security. Rachel answered the boarding house's main telephone and called up to our room. "Janet, it's for you. Says she's Dorothy from San Francisco." My blood turned to ice. Dorothy and I had agreed that she would only call in case of emergency. Any regular communication might create a trail that could be followed. If she was calling, something was terribly wrong. "Janet, Dorothy's voice was tight with tension. "I'm sorry to have to tell you this, but James found out where you went." The words hit me like a physical blow. "How?"
Zoe. He threatened her family, said he'd make trouble for her husband's business if she didn't tell him what she knew. She held out as long as she could, but when he started following her children to school,
I understood. Zoe had protected us as long as she could, but no one could be expected to sacrifice their own children for someone else's safety. "How much does he know?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper.
He knows you went to San Francisco, first knows you stayed with me. He doesn't have your exact location in San Diego yet, but he's coming. He took time off work, told people his wife had a mental breakdown, and kidnapped his daughter. He's planning to drive down there and look for you."
The familiar panic flooded through my system. The hypervigilance, the constant fear, the sense that walls were closing in around me. Just when I'd started to breathe freely, the cage was reaching out to reclaim me. "What do I do?" I asked.
"You have options," Dorothy said. "You can run again. I have contacts in Arizona, New Mexico, places where you could disappear completely. Or you can stay and fight. The laws are changing, Janet. Domestic violence is being taken more seriously. You have rights now that you didn't have before."
That night, I sat in our small room while Marina slept, staring out the window at the San Diego skyline and trying to decide between running and fighting. Running felt familiar. It's what we'd been doing for months. But it also felt like giving James permanent power over our lives, condemning us to exist as perpetual fugitives who could never settle anywhere, never build lasting relationships, never truly be free. Fighting, on the other hand, meant confronting him directly, risking everything we'd built, gambling that the legal system would protect us better than it had protected women in the past. I thought about Marina, about the woman I wanted her to become. Did I want her to learn that the only response to abuse was to run and hide? Or did I want to show her that women could stand up for themselves, could demand protection, could refuse to live in fear? The next morning, I walked into the San Diego Police Department and asked to speak with someone about domestic violence. The desk sergeant, a middle-aged man with kind eyes, directed me to Detective Sarah Chen, no relation to Mary Chen from the bus station, who specialized in family violence cases. Detective Chen listened to my story without interruption, taking notes and asking questions that showed she understood the dynamics of abusive relationships. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and studied me with frank appraisal. "You're right to be scared," she said. "Men like your husband don't give up easily, but you're also right to fight back. We have tools now that we didn't have even 5 years ago. Restraining orders that actually mean something, stalking laws, victim advocacy programs." She opened a file folder and began pulling out forms. "The first thing we're going to do is get you a restraining order. Then we're going to register you and your daughter in our domestic violence protection program. If he shows up in San Diego, if he tries to contact you or approach you in any way, he'll be arrested immediately." The restraining order was served on James at his workplace in Oakland, delivered by a sheriff's deputy who made it clear that any violation would result in immediate arrest. According to Dorothy, who heard about it through the neighborhood network, James flew into a rage that was visible to his co-workers, threatening to teach that bitch a lesson about defying her husband. Within 24 hours of receiving the restraining order, James was in San Diego. He found us through the simple expedient of visiting every elementary school in the area and looking for a girl who fit Marina's description. It was a systematic search that took him 3 days, but on Thursday afternoon he was waiting outside Marina's school when classes were dismissed. Marina saw him first, told me later that she spotted his familiar green eyes through the chain-link fence and felt her blood turn to ice. Instead of running to him or trying to hide, she did something that made me prouder than anything she'd ever accomplished. She walked directly to her teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, and said, "That man by the fence is my father, and I'm not allowed to go near him." Mrs. Rodriguez, who had been briefed about our situation by the school administration, immediately called the police while keeping Marina safely inside the building. By the time I arrived at the school, having been contacted by the principal, 3 police cars were in the parking lot and James was in handcuffs. But seeing him again, even under these circumstances, brought back every instinct of fear and submission that I'd worked so hard to overcome. He looked older, thinner, with lines around his eyes that hadn't been there 6 months earlier. But those green eyes still held the same possessive intensity, the same certainty that I belonged to him, regardless of what any court order said. "Janet," he called to me as the officers prepared to take him away. "This is insane! I'm her father! She's my daughter! You can't keep her from me forever!" For a moment, I felt the old urge to apologize, to explain, to somehow make peace with him. But then, I looked at Marina standing beside me with her hand firmly gripped in mine, and I remembered why we'd left in the first place. You lost the right to call yourself her father when you raised your hand to strike her. I said, my voice steady despite the trembling in my legs. You lost the right to call yourself my husband when you chose violence over love.
James spent 3 days in jail before making bail, but the restraining order meant he couldn't remain in San Diego. He returned to Oakland and hired a lawyer, beginning a legal battle that would stretch over the next year as he fought for visitation rights and custody of Marina. The court proceedings were a nightmare of depositions, character witnesses, and legal maneuvering that drained our savings and tested every ounce of strength I'd gained over the months since our escape. James presented himself as a concerned father whose unstable wife had kidnapped his child, while I had to relive years of abuse in graphic detail for strangers who would decide our fate.
The turning point came when Marina, now 12 years old, was asked to speak privately with the judge about her preferences. She was calm, articulate, and absolutely clear about her wish to remain with me in San Diego. More importantly, she was able to describe specific incidents of violence she'd witnessed, providing corroboration for my testimony that even James's lawyer couldn't dismiss. "Your Honor," Marina said, according to the court transcript I was given later, "my father isn't a bad man, but he makes bad choices when he's angry. I don't want to live with someone who makes me afraid to make noise when I'm playing, or who makes my mother cry in the bathroom where she thinks I can't hear her." The judge, the Honorable Maria Santos, granted me full custody and made the restraining order permanent. James was allowed supervised visitation once a month, but only if he completed anger management courses and submitted to psychological evaluation.
He never took advantage of those visitation rights. His lawyer contacted mine 6 months later to say that James had decided to move on with his life and would not be pursuing further contact with Marina or me.
With the legal battle behind us, Marina and I could finally focus on building, rather than just surviving. I continued working as a house cleaner, but I also enrolled in night classes to earn my high school diploma. At 32 years old, I sat in classrooms with teenagers and young adults struggling with algebra and English composition, determined to give myself the education that had been denied to me as a child. Marina thrived in her new environment. She made friends, easily excelled in her studies, and gradually lost the hypervigilance that had marked her early years. She joined the school choir, learned to play soccer, and developed the kind of easy confidence that comes from growing up in an environment where your worth isn't constantly questioned. I'll never forget the day she came home from school bursting with excitement to tell me about a career day presentation she'd attended. Mama, did you know that women can be doctors and lawyers and business owners? Mrs. Patterson, who came to speak to our class, she owns 3 restaurants and has 27 employees. The wonder in her voice broke my heart and filled it simultaneously. At 13, she was just discovering possibilities that I'd only begun to imagine for myself in my 30s.
"You can be anything you want to be, sweetheart," I told her. "Anything at all." My transformation from victim to survivor to advocate began with Mrs. Celeste Morrison, one of the wealthy women whose house I cleaned twice a week. She was in her 70s, a widow who had raised 4 children and built a successful real estate business after her husband's death. She had the kind of quiet dignity that comes from surviving hardship and emerging stronger. Mrs. Morrison noticed the textbooks I sometimes brought with me, the way I studied during my lunch breaks, the careful attention I paid to her advice about managing money and making investments.
Janet, she said one afternoon as I was cleaning her kitchen. "You're wasting your talents scrubbing floors. Not that there's anything wrong with honest work, but you have a mind that could take you much further if you'd let it."
She offered to pay for me to attend community college to study business or social work or whatever interested me. It was an act of generosity that seemed too good to be true, but Mrs. Morrison was adamant.
"I never had daughters," she explained. "My boys are successful men with their own lives. I'd like to invest in a young woman who reminds me of myself at your age, determined, intelligent, and held back by circumstances rather than ability."
I enrolled at San Diego Community College studying social work with a focus on domestic violence advocacy. The irony of using my own experience of abuse to help other women wasn't lost on me, but it felt like a way of transforming something terrible into something meaningful. My professors were impressed by the insight I brought to classroom discussions, the first-hand knowledge that couldn't be learned from textbooks. I wrote papers about the psychology of abusive relationships, the barriers that prevent women from leaving the resources that could make the difference between staying trapped and finding freedom. After earning my associate degree, I was hired by the San Diego Women's Crisis Center as a victim advocate. My job was to help women navigate the legal system, find safe housing access, financial resources, and rebuild their lives after leaving abusive relationships. It was work that felt like a calling, rather than just employment. The women I worked with came from all backgrounds. Wealthy suburban housewives, immigrant women with limited English, teenagers barely out of high school, elderly women who had endured decades of abuse. But they all shared the same look of desperate hope, mixed with paralyzing fear, that I recognized from my own mirror during those first months in San Diego.
"How did you do it?" they would ask. "How did you find the courage to leave? How did you survive?" I would tell them the truth that courage wasn't a single moment of decision, but a series of small choices made one day at a time. That survival wasn't about being strong enough to do everything alone, but about being smart enough to accept help when it was offered. That freedom wasn't a destination you reached, but a journey you continued making every day.
One of my first clients was a woman named Patricia, whose husband had broken her arm and threatened to kill her if she ever tried to leave. She arrived at the crisis center with 2 young children and $17 to her name, convinced that she was too old, too uneducated, too damaged to start over.
6 months later, Patricia had completed a certified nursing assistant program, found a job at a local hospital, and moved with her children into their own apartment. At the ceremony where she received her CNA certificate, she asked me to stand with her as she accepted her diploma.
"You saved my life," she said, tears streaming down her face.
"No," I replied. "You saved your own life. I just helped you remember that you could." Marina graduated from high school as valedictorian of her class, earning a full scholarship to UC San Diego, where she studied elementary education. Watching her walk across that graduation stage, confident and accomplished and free, I thought about the frightened 11-year-old who had thrown hot water at her father to protect her mother, and I marveled at the strength that had been inside her all along. She became a teacher as she'd always dreamed, working with children in underserved communities and developing programs to identify and help kids who showed signs of living with domestic violence. She married a gentleman named David who treated her with the respect and equality that she'd learned to expect from relationships, and they had 2 children, my grandchildren, who would never know what it felt like to walk on eggshells around an angry man. I continued working at the crisis center, eventually becoming the program director and overseeing the expansion of services to include emergency housing, job training, and long-term counseling. The work was challenging, funding was always tight, the need always greater than our resources, the success stories sometimes overshadowed by the women we couldn't save. But it was also deeply fulfilling in a way that I'd never expected work could be. Every woman who found the courage to leave an abusive relationship, every child who grew up learning that violence wasn't normal, every family that broke the cycle of abuse, they were all victories that made my own suffering feel meaningful. James died alone in Oakland on a rainy Tuesday in March 2010,
nearly 23 years after Marina and I had fled from him. I learned of his death through a phone call from his sister, who had tracked me down through the crisis center where I worked.
I thought you should know, she said, her voice carefully neutral. He never remarried, never had other children. I think he spent all those years waiting for you to come back. I felt no joy at the news, but also no grief. James had been erased from my emotional landscape so completely that his death registered more as the closing of a book I'd finished reading long ago than as any kind of loss.
Marina, now 34, and a mother herself, took the news with similar equanimity.
I'm sorry he never found peace, she said. But I'm not sorry he's gone, and I'm grateful every day that we found the courage to leave when we did.
At his funeral, which neither of us attended, James was eulogized as a devoted bank employee and community member, whose life had been marked by the tragedy of losing his family to his wife's mental instability. The narrative he'd constructed to explain our absence had become his truth, the story he'd told so often that he'd probably come to believe it himself.
I felt a strange sense of closure, knowing that his version of our story would die with him, while the truth, the real story of what we'd endured and how we'd escaped, would live on in the women I counseled, the programs I'd helped develop, and the children who would grow up free because their mothers had found the courage to leave.
Looking back now from the perspective of 68 years, I can see patterns and lessons that weren't visible while I was living through the experience. The most important lesson is that abuse doesn't happen all at once. It's a gradual process of isolation, control, and psychological manipulation that makes the victim complicit in her own imprisonment. The second lesson is that leaving is not a single act of courage, but a series of small decisions made over time. Deciding to save coins, deciding to accept an invitation to tea, deciding to trust strangers with your secrets, deciding to value your own life and your daughter's future more than your fear of the unknown. The third lesson is that you cannot heal from abuse in isolation. Recovery requires community, other women who understand what you've experienced, professionals who can help you navigate systems and resources, advocates who will stand with you when you're too weak to stand alone. The fourth lesson is that healing is not a destination, but a journey. There are still nights when I wake up in a panic, thinking I hear James's key in the lock. There are still moments when someone raises their voice and I instinctively flinch. The scars remain, but they no longer define me. The final lesson is that survival can be transformed into purpose. The worst experiences of our lives can become the source of our greatest contributions to the world if we're willing to use our pain to help others avoid or escape similar circumstances. The grandmother I never expected to become. Today, as I sit on my porch in Monterey, California, watching my grandchildren play in the yard while their parents, my accomplished daughter, and her loving husband prepare dinner in the kitchen, I am acutely aware of how different this life is from anything I could have imagined during those dark years in Oakland. My grandchildren, Emma and James. Yes, we named him James. Reclaiming the name from its association with fear, are growing up in a world where women's equality is assumed rather than fought for, where domestic violence is recognized as a crime rather than a private family matter, where children are taught that they have the right to feel safe in their own homes. Emma, at 8 years old, is fierce and confident in ways that her grandmother never learned to be. She plays soccer, excels in math, and talks about becoming an astronaut or a veterinarian, with the assumption that these careers are perfectly attainable for girls. When she disagrees with something, she says so clearly and without fear. James, at 6, is gentle and empathetic, quick to comfort anyone who seems sad, careful with smaller children and animals. He's learning to identify and express his emotions in healthy ways, skills that his grandfather never possessed, and that his grandmother had to learn as an adult. Watching them, I am struck by the realization that breaking the cycle of abuse doesn't just save the woman who finds the courage to leave it, saves her children, her grandchildren, and all the generations that come after. every woman who refuses to accept violence as normal, who teaches her children that they deserve respect and safety, who models healthy relationships and emotional regulation, is contributing to a world where fewer children grow up afraid. If there's one thing I want readers to understand from my story, it's this: it's never too late to start over. I was 30 years old with a fourth-grade education, no job skills, no money, and an 11-year-old daughter to protect when I finally found the courage to leave. If I could rebuild my life from nothing, anyone can. You don't have to be perfect to deserve better. You don't have to be strong enough to do it alone. You don't have to have all the answers before you take the first step. You just have to believe somewhere deep inside that you and your children deserve to live without fear. The resources that helped me escape and rebuild crisis centers, legal aid, emergency housing, job training programs still exist and have expanded dramatically since the 1980s. The women who helped me, Dorothy, Rachel, Susan, Mrs. Morrison, Detective Chen, represent a network of support that reaches into every community, ready to help when you're ready to accept help. Most importantly, you don't have to know how the story ends before you start writing a new chapter. I had no idea when Marina and I climbed into that truck in San Francisco that I would eventually become an advocate for other women, that I would earn a college degree, that I would live to see my daughter become an accomplished teacher and loving mother. I just knew that staying was slowly killing us both, and that anything else had to be better. At 68, I am still learning, still growing, still discovering new aspects of myself that were buried under years of fear and submission. I'm taking art classes, learning to paint landscapes that capture the beauty I'm finally free to see. I'm traveling to places I'd only read about in books, experiencing the world as an independent woman, rather than as someone's possession. Marina and I have rebuilt our relationship on a foundation of mutual respect and shared experience. She is not just my daughter, but also my friend, my colleague, in the work of helping other families break cycles of violence, and my teacher in the ongoing process of healing from our shared trauma. The Crisis Center, where I worked for over 2 decades, has expanded to include transitional housing, job training programs, legal advocacy, and children's services. The work continues because, unfortunately, the need continues. But progress is being made. Domestic violence is no longer a secret shame that families hide, but a recognized crime that communities work together to prevent and address. I still receive letters from women I helped years ago, updating me on their lives, their children's accomplishments, their continued journey toward healing and independence. These letters are treasures to me, proof that the decision Marina and I made on that desperate morning in 1987 has rippled outward in ways we never could have imagined. When people ask me if I regret anything about my life, the years lost to abuse, the education denied, the opportunities missed, I always answer the same way. I regret the pain, but I don't regret the journey. Every experience, even the worst ones, has contributed to making me who I am today. The woman who survived James's abuse is the same woman who found the courage to leave, who rebuilt her life from nothing, who dedicated herself to helping others do the same. The scared 17-year-old who married her jailer is still part of me, but she no longer defines me. She is joined by the desperate 30-year-old who chose freedom over familiarity, the determined student who earned her degree in her 40s, the accomplished advocate who changed laws and saved lives, and the peaceful grandmother who finally learned to rest without looking over her shoulder. If you are reading this while living in fear, while wondering if escape is possible, while questioning whether you have the strength to leave, please know that you do. The courage is already inside you, waiting for the right moment to emerge. The resources exist to help you succeed. The women who've walked this path before you are ready to guide you through it. Your story doesn't have to end with abuse. Like mine, it can transform into something beautiful, something meaningful, something that helps heal not just your own wounds, but the wounds of others who will follow in your footsteps. You are stronger than you know. You deserve better than you're getting. And you are never, ever alone.
The sun is setting now over Monterey Bay, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink. My grandchildren are calling for me to come watch them perform a play they've created about brave princesses who rescue themselves. And I'm thinking about how perfect that is, the next generation learning that they don't need to wait for someone else to save them, that they have the power to write their own happy endings. Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for believing that it matters. And if you're out there somewhere afraid and wondering if things can ever get better, please know that they can. They absolutely can. Your life is waiting for you to claim it. Don't let anyone, not even fear, convince you that you don't deserve to be free. With love and hope, Grandma Janet.